Good morning, everybody. So I wanted to touch on surrender again today, talk a little bit more about some additional reading in The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle and how that relates to some of the other stuff that we've read over the last few months. One of the things that Tolle says is in answering the question about how do we actively surrender, his response is start by acknowledging that there is resistance. Be there when it happens, when the resistance arises. Observe how your mind creates it, how it labels the situation, yourself, or others. Now, to me, this sounds very similar to the mindfulness that we've read about in other books. So in the Tao of Sobriety, we read about the importance of mindfulness, of staying in touch with whatever happens, including the good, the bad, the indifferent. The same idea comes up in the 12-step Buddhist in terms of practicing acceptance by allowing ourselves to recall an experience without getting overwhelmed. Again, we see the idea of practice coming into this, the importance of practicing this. It's not something you can just flick a light switch on and off. It's something you have to practice, you get better at. And so why is this important? Well, the idea of surrendering, of being mindful of what's going on, is the key to, from the perspective of all of these folks, it's the key to spiritual growth, spiritual enlightenment, spiritual foundation. And Tolle puts it this way. He says, until you practice surrender, the spiritual dimension is something you read about, talk about, get excited about, write books about, think about, believe in, or don't, as the case may be, makes no difference. Not until you surrender does it become a reality in your life. And the idea of surrender also comes up in, it's funny, the word surrender is never actually mentioned in the big book. The idea that we're talking about here certainly is. But it is mentioned in one of the stories that was in the first edition of the book. It's not in the current edition, but the name of the story is called The Professor and the Paradox. And he writes about the paradoxes of AA, the rules that don't seem to make sense when you look at them. And one of the big rules, the first rule that he writes about is we surrender to win. On the face of it, surrendering certainly does not seem like winning, but it is in AA. Only after we have come to the end of our rope, hit a stone wall in some aspect of our lives beyond which we can go no further, only when we hit bottom in despair and surrender can we accomplish sobriety, which we could never accomplish before. We must and we do surrender in order to win. This is certainly what happened in my life. I was resisting life and resisted and continued to use drugs and alcohol to cope with the pain and the struggle that was brought on by that resistance. It was only when I was brought to my knees by unbelievable depression, well, you guys would believe it, but what most people would consider unbelievable depression and anxiety. It was only in that moment that I found the strength to say, I give up, I surrender, I will do what people tell me to do to find my way through life. And I will follow the path that other people lay out, at least until I know how to make a path in my own way. And it's probably the best thing that has ever happened to me because it's enabled me to then live my life in a way I never dreamed of, as an adult. I never dreamed I could do the kinds of things that I am doing right now, and that I could be in the moment in the way that I'm doing right now. I thought I was doomed to be an anxious, depressed, sad person, and that was just the way it was going to be, and I was some tragic figure that would end up either dying of some liver disease or, jumping off of a bridge. And I had surrendered to that idea in my addiction. But there is so much hope and so much joy and so much peace. That's the most important thing. There's so much peace in the surrender I've found in recovery. And the daily practice of surrender is surrendering to the situation that we're in as it is and not resisting that. Again, as I've mentioned before, and as everybody who I've read mentions, that doesn't mean we can't work for change in our lives or change in the world. It doesn't mean giving up and just saying whatever and becoming indifferent. There's a big difference between surrender and indifference. Surrender is akin to acceptance, and that's really what we're looking for here. Acceptance of things the way they are, willingness to do what we need to change them and do the right thing to change them. But if there is nothing we can do to change them, then accepting them as they are. So, lots of good stuff here. It's clear that a lot of the spiritual writers and thinkers really feel that surrender, acceptance, and the practice of those things is a key part of maintaining your spiritual foundation and a good way to start the process and continue the process of spiritual growth. So, enjoyed reading this morning, and I'll be back here tomorrow morning with more.